My daughter stole $22,000 and mocked my wife's memory, then learned the broke old man she betrayed could unleash a counterstrike she'd never see coming. The crisp October morning felt different as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the empty checking account balance on my laptop screen. $0.37. After 42 years of careful saving, meticulous planning, and dreams of finally seeing the Swiss Alps with my late wife's ashes, everything was gone. But here's the thing nobody knew about me, not even my own daughter who'd just stolen my life savings. I was worth over $10 million, and she had no idea what she'd just unleashed. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The phone call had come 3 days earlier. Sarah's voice, sweet and desperate, the way it always sounded when she needed money. "Dad, I'm in serious trouble. The mortgage company is threatening foreclosure. If I don't come up with $18,000 by Friday, we'll lose the house. The kids will be homeless." I'd heard variations of this story for 15 years. Ever since her husband Mark lost his job at the accounting firm, Sarah had developed a pattern of financial emergencies that somehow always required my intervention. The car breaking down right before Christmas, medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, credit card debt that had spiraled out of control because of circumstances beyond their control. Each time I'd transferred money from my savings account, the one I'd labeled Switzerland Trip Fund, in my careful handwriting on the bank folder. The account where I'd been depositing money for 12 years, ever since Margaret died, and I'd promised her I'd scatter her ashes in the place where we'd honeymooned 43 years ago. Margaret had always been the strong one in our marriage. She'd handled the bills, managed our investments, made the difficult decisions while I focused on my work as a high school mathematics teacher. When the cancer took her, she'd made me promise 2 things. First, that I'd learn to manage money properly and take care of myself. Second, that I'd take her back to Switzerland one more time. The Switzerland Fund had grown slowly but steadily. $25 here, $50 there. Birthday money from my sister, the small inheritance from my father, tax refunds that I didn't need for daily expenses. By last month, it had reached $22,000, enough for a decent trip, a proper hotel, and the kind of experience Margaret would have wanted. But Sarah's voice on the phone had carried that familiar note of panic that always made my chest tighten with paternal worry. "Dad, I know you've been saving for your trip, but this is an emergency. We'll pay you back, I promise. We just need to get through this crisis, and then things will turn around." I'd stared at Margaret's photo on my desk while Sarah talked. My wife's gentle smile seemed to be telling me what she'd always told me when the kids needed help. "Family comes first, Robert. The trip can wait." So I'd done what I always did. I'd driven to the bank, withdrawn the entire balance, and handed Sarah a cashier's check for $22,000. Every penny I'd saved for Switzerland, every dollar that represented a promise to my dead wife. That was Tuesday. By Thursday evening, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw Sarah's post. "Amazing girls' weekend in Las Vegas with my sister and college friends." Sometimes you just need to treat yourself. The photos showed her and 3 other women at expensive restaurants, holding cocktails that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, posing in what looked like a luxury hotel suite. My hands had started shaking as I scrolled through the album. Sarah laughing at a blackjack table. Sarah and her friends at a spa, faces covered in some kind of green treatment that looked like it cost more than my car payment. Sarah holding shopping bags from stores I'd never heard of but that screamed expensive. The final photo in the series showed a receipt. Not clearly enough to read the details, but visible enough to see the total at the bottom. $4,738. For one dinner. One single meal that cost more than I spent on food in 3 months. I'd sat in my small kitchen, surrounded by the modest furniture Margaret and I had bought decades ago, looking at pictures of my daughter spending my Switzerland money on luxury I couldn't even imagine. The money I'd saved by eating generic cereal and skipping meals. The money that represented every sacrifice I'd made since Margaret died. But the real punch to the gut came when I clicked on the comments below her photos. Mark had written, "So proud of my amazing wife for finally putting herself first for once. You deserve every minute of this." Her sister Linda had replied, "About time you stopped letting guilt hold you back from living your best life." And Sarah had responded to both comments with, Thanks for encouraging me to stop being such a people pleaser. Sometimes you have to choose yourself over other people's expectations. Other people's expectations. That's what my promise to Margaret had become in her mind. That's what my dream of honoring my wife's memory represented to the daughter I'd raised and supported through every crisis for 43 years. I'd closed my laptop and walked to my bedroom, where Margaret's ashes sat in their simple wooden box on my dresser. I'd bought the box 12 years ago, planning to carry it with me to Switzerland within a year or two. Now it sat gathering dust, while my daughter posted pictures of herself living like a celebrity on money she'd obtained by lying to me. The next morning, I'd called my bank to check my account balance, hoping maybe Sarah had only taken part of the money. Maybe there was enough left for a smaller trip, something modest but meaningful. That's when I saw the screen that broke something inside me. $0.37. But here's what Sarah didn't know. What nobody in my family knew, because I'd learned from Margaret's death that money makes people act in ways you never expect. When Margaret died, I'd inherited her investment portfolio. She'd been quietly building wealth for decades through careful stock purchases, real estate investments, and a small business she'd run from our basement. Things she'd never told me about because she knew I was terrible with money and would worry about every fluctuation in the market. The day after her funeral, her lawyer had handed me documents that changed my understanding of everything. Margaret hadn't just been a careful housewife who balanced our checkbook. She'd been a financial genius who'd built a fortune while I graded algebra tests and worried about whether we could afford a new refrigerator. The portfolio was worth $4.2 million. The real estate investments had grown to $3.1 million. The business, which I'd thought was just a hobby, was generating 6 figures in annual passive income. Combined with some other assets I'd never known existed, my net worth had gone from approximately $50,000 to over $10 million overnight. Margaret had left me a letter explaining everything. How she'd hidden the wealth because she knew it would make me uncomfortable. How she'd planned to reveal it gradually after we both retired. How she'd wanted me to use it to live comfortably and pursue the dreams we'd talked about but never thought we could afford. The letter had ended with instructions that haunted me still. Don't tell the children about this money until you're sure they love you for who you are, not what you can provide. Money changes people, Robert, even good people, especially family. For 12 years, I'd followed her advice. I'd lived modestly on my teacher's pension while the investments grew larger every month. I'd let Sarah and her brother think I was a struggling widower living paycheck to paycheck. I'd wanted to know who they really were when they thought I had nothing to offer them except love. Now I knew. Sarah had stolen my trip fund not because she was facing foreclosure, but because she wanted a luxury vacation and saw me as an easy target. The mortgage crisis had been completely fabricated. I'd confirmed that with a simple phone call to her bank, where a helpful representative had told me that the Hendersons were current on all their payments and had never received any foreclosure notices. The daughter I'd raised to value honesty and compassion had looked me in the eye and lied to steal money she thought represented my entire life savings, money she knew was meant to honor her mother's memory. But Sarah had made one critical mistake in her deception. She'd assumed that $22,000 was all I had. She'd calculated that stealing everything from her elderly father was worth the risk because what was I going to do about it? How was a broke retired teacher going to fight back against someone younger, smarter, and more connected than him? She was about to find out exactly what $10 million could do in the hands of someone who'd finally learned the difference between being generous and being a fool. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I'd been avoiding for years. Harrison Blackwell, Margaret's former lawyer, the man who'd handled her estate and had been managing my investments ever since. A man who specialized in protecting wealthy families from the exact kind of manipulation I'd just experienced. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, Harrison Blackwell speaking. Harrison, this is Robert Chen. I think it's time we had that conversation about my daughter you've been suggesting for the past decade. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been satisfaction. I've been wondering when you'd call, Robert. What finally happened? She stole my trip money. $22,000, everything I'd saved to honor Margaret's memory. But that's not even the worst part. What's the worst part? She lied to get it, completely fabricated an emergency, then spent it on a luxury vacation while posting about choosing herself over other people's expectations. My wife's final wish became other people's expectations in her mind. Another pause. How much does she think you're worth, Robert? Nothing. She thinks I'm a broke old man living on Social Security and a tiny pension. She has no idea about Margaret's investments. Perfect. That gives us significant leverage. How far are you willing to go to teach her a lesson? I looked at Margaret's photo on my desk, remembering the woman who'd been strong enough to build a fortune while protecting me from the burden of managing it. The woman who'd been wise enough to warn me about what money could do to people we loved. As far as it takes, I said. She wanted to choose herself over family expectations. Let's see how that works out when she discovers what family she actually chose to betray. When I hung up the phone 20 minutes later, I had an appointment scheduled for the next morning. Not just with Harrison, but with his entire team. The accountants, investigators, and legal specialists who'd been waiting 12 years for me to stop being a victim and start being a man with resources. Sarah thought she'd stolen from a helpless old man. Tomorrow, she'd begin learning what it meant to steal from someone who could afford to make her life very complicated, very quickly, and very publicly. The war had begun, and she didn't even know she'd enlisted. The meeting with Harrison's team took place in a glass conference room 40 floors above downtown, the kind of space I'd never imagined myself occupying. 3 people sat across from me at a mahogany table that probably cost more than my annual grocery budget. Harrison himself, looking exactly as sharp and calculating as he had at Margaret's funeral. Patricia Wong, a forensic accountant whose business card listed more credentials than I had years of teaching experience. And James Mitchell, a private investigator whose quiet demeanor suggested he'd seen enough family betrayals to write a book about them. Harrison spread a folder across the table between us. Inside were bank statements, investment summaries, and property valuations that still made my head spin even after 12 years of quarterly reports. The numbers had grown since Margaret's death. Significantly. Robert, your current net worth sits at approximately $12.4 million. The real estate portfolio alone has appreciated by 60% since Margaret passed. Her technology investments have performed exceptionally well, particularly the early positions in companies that were just startups when she bought in. Patricia leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. Tell us exactly what happened with your daughter. Every detail, every conversation, every lie she told. We need to understand the full scope of her deception before we can craft an appropriate response. I walked them through Sarah's phone call, the fabricated mortgage crisis, the cashier's check I'd handed over without question. Then, I pulled out my phone and showed them the Facebook photos that had shattered whatever remained of my trust in my own child. James studied the images with professional detachment. Las Vegas, high-end establishments. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. She planned this trip, booked expensive accommodations, made reservations at restaurants that require weeks of advance notice. The timeline suggests she decided to steal your money before she even called you. The word steal hung in the air like smoke. I'd been thinking of it as borrowing, as a family emergency, as Sarah making a mistake under pressure. But James was right. This had been premeditated theft, carefully orchestrated and executed against someone she believed was defenseless. Patricia's pen moved across her pad in quick, precise strokes. We'll need to document everything. Bank records showing the withdrawal, screenshots of her social media posts, any text messages or emails related to the supposed mortgage crisis. If we're going to take action, we need an airtight case. What kind of action are you suggesting? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Harrison's smile was thin and professional. That depends on what you want to accomplish, Robert. Do you want your money back? Do you want her to understand the consequences of lying to family? Or do you want something more comprehensive? I thought about Margaret's letter, the one I'd read hundreds of times over the past 12 years. Don't tell the children about this money until you're sure they love you for who you are, not what you can provide. Money changes people, Robert, even good people, especially family. Margaret had been protecting me from learning this lesson the hard way. But Sarah had forced the lesson on me anyway, and now I had to decide what to do with the knowledge. I want her to understand what she's done, I said finally. Not just the money. The lying, the betrayal, the way she turned my promise to Margaret into something selfish and manipulative. I want consequences that match the crime. James opened his laptop and began typing. We can start with a comprehensive background check. Financial records, social media activity, employment history, credit reports. If she's been lying to you about money, she's probably been lying to other people too. Banks, credit card companies, maybe even her employer. Patricia nodded approvingly. Financial fraud often follows patterns. People who steal from family members usually have other deceptive behaviors. We might find leverage points you're not aware of yet. Harrison pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like a contact list. I'm going to recommend we bring in a reputation management specialist as well. Someone who understands how to control narratives when family disputes become public. Because they will become public, Robert. When someone with your resources decides to fight back, it tends to attract attention. The thought of public attention made my stomach clench. I'd spent my entire career as a teacher trying to avoid drama, keeping my head down, staying out of conflicts. But Sarah had dragged me into this fight, and backing down now would only encourage her to see me as a permanent source of emergency funding. What about her children? I asked. My grandchildren. They don't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. James looked up from his laptop. How old are they? 12 and 14. Good kids as far as I know, though I haven't seen them much lately. Sarah always has excuses for why family gatherings don't work out. That's another pattern, Patricia said, making more notes. Financial manipulators often isolate their victims from other family members. It makes the deception easier to maintain. We can structure any action to minimize impact on the children, Harrison assured me. In fact, protecting them might be part of the solution. Courts tend to look favorably on grandparents who can provide stability when parents make poor decisions. The implications of his words settled over me slowly. We weren't just talking about getting my money back or teaching Sarah a lesson. We were talking about potentially changing the entire structure of my family's life. I need to know something, I said, looking at each of them in turn. In your professional opinions, is there any chance Sarah actually needed that money for legitimate reasons? Any possibility that I'm overreacting to what might have been a desperate mother making a poor choice? The three of them exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their experience with similar cases. Patricia answered first. Robert, we've seen thousands of these situations. Desperate people don't post vacation photos on social media while claiming financial hardship. Desperate people don't spend $4,000 on a single dinner when they're facing foreclosure. This wasn't desperation. This was calculated exploitation of your generosity and trust. James pulled up something on his laptop screen and turned it toward me. I've already run a preliminary check on your daughter's financial situation. She and her husband own their home outright, no mortgage at all. They have approximately $40,000 in combined checking and savings accounts. Their credit scores are excellent. There was never any foreclosure threat because there was never any mortgage to foreclose on. The room fell silent as the full scope of Sarah's deception became clear. She hadn't just lied about needing the money. She'd fabricated an entire crisis, complete with specific details about mortgage companies and deadlines, while sitting on a comfortable financial cushion that was larger than anything I'd had before Margaret died. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional to something that might have been sympathetic. Robert, I've been managing your wife's investments for over 20 years. I watched her build this wealth specifically so you could live with dignity and security in your later years. She never wanted you to be anyone's ATM, especially not your own children's. Margaret had known. Somehow she'd anticipated this exact scenario and tried to protect me from it. But her protection had also left me unprepared for the reality of what people would do when they thought I was vulnerable and alone. What happens next? I asked. Harrison smiled, and this time there was nothing thin or professional about it. This time, it was the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work. Next, we show your daughter what happens when you steal from someone who can afford to hire the best legal team money can buy. We're going to educate her about the difference between a helpless old man and a millionaire who's finally decided to stop being generous to people who mistake kindness for weakness. Patricia gathered her notes into a neat stack. We'll need you to sign some documents authorizing us to act on your behalf. Once that's done, we can move very quickly. Sarah will start seeing consequences within 48 hours. What kind of consequences? James closed his laptop with a soft click. The kind that make people wish they'd never heard the phrase, easy target. I thought about Margaret's ashes sitting on my dresser, about the promise I'd made to take her back to Switzerland, about the daughter who'd stolen that dream to fund her own selfish pleasures. I thought about 12 years of living modestly while my investments grew, 12 years of being careful with money while Sarah assumed I was just another broke old man she could manipulate. "Where do I sign?" I asked. Harrison slid a document across the table. The header read, "Authorization for Comprehensive Asset Protection and Recovery Services." Below that, in smaller print, were clauses that would give his team permission to investigate, pursue, and recover damages in ways I couldn't even imagine. As I signed my name at the bottom, I felt something shift inside me. For 12 years, I'd been Robert Chen, the widowed teacher, living quietly and hoping my children loved me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Starting now, I was going to be Robert Chen the millionaire, who'd finally learned that sometimes love isn't enough, and that people who steal from family deserve exactly what they get. The war Sarah had started was about to become very expensive for her. She just didn't know it yet. The documents were signed by 3:30 that afternoon, and Harrison's team moved with the efficiency of people who'd orchestrated financial warfare many times before. Patricia had already begun pulling Sarah's financial records through legal channels I didn't fully understand but apparently had every right to access. James was compiling what he called a comprehensive behavioral profile, tracking her spending patterns and social media activity going back 5 years. By evening, I was back in my modest kitchen, staring at Margaret's photo and wondering if she'd approve of what I'd set in motion. The woman who'd hidden millions from me to protect my peace of mind probably wouldn't have wanted me to use those same millions to destroy our daughter. But she also wouldn't have wanted Sarah to steal from me while I grieved her memory. My phone buzzed with a text from Harrison. "Phase 1 complete. Your daughter's credit monitoring will show some interesting activity starting tomorrow morning. Recommend you don't answer her calls for the next 72 hours. Let her wonder what's happening." I set the phone down and walked to my bedroom, where Margaret's ashes waited in their simple wooden box. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin learning that actions have consequences. More importantly, she'd discover that the father she'd been lying to and stealing from wasn't the helpless victim she'd imagined. The next morning brought autumn rain and the first phone call from Sarah. I let it ring through to voicemail while I made coffee and read the newspaper like any other retired teacher on any other Thursday. The second call came 20 minutes later. Then a third. By noon, she'd called 11 times. I finally listened to the voicemails during lunch. The progression told a story that would have been amusing if it hadn't been so pathetic. The first message was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey Dad, just calling to see how you're doing. Hope you're not too upset about having to postpone your trip. We'll figure out a way to pay you back soon, I promise." By the fourth message, confusion had crept into her voice. "Dad, I'm getting some weird calls from credit monitoring services, something about suspicious activity on accounts I didn't even know were being monitored. Can you call me back?" I'm starting to worry. The eighth message carried the first note of panic. "Dad, where are you? I've been trying to reach you all day. There are people asking questions about our finances, and I don't understand what's happening. Please call me back right away." The 11th message was pure desperation. "Dad, I know you're angry about the trip money, but whatever you're doing, please stop. Mark is furious, and I'm scared. People are calling our house, our jobs, asking questions about things that are none of their business. This isn't like you. Please, just call me back and let's talk about this like adults." Like adults. The irony was beautiful. Sarah wanted to discuss adult behavior after stealing $22,000 from her elderly father. She wanted mature conversation after fabricating an entire mortgage crisis and spending my life savings on luxury vacations. My phone rang again as I was finishing the last voicemail. This time, it wasn't Sarah. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, a familiar voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Chen, this is Patricia Wong from Harrison Blackwell's office. I wanted to give you an update on this morning's activities." I settled deeper into my chair, surprised by how much I was enjoying this conversation. "What kind of activities?" "We've initiated financial audits with 3 major credit agencies, flagging unusual spending patterns that suggest potential identity theft or fraudulent account usage. Your daughter and her husband are now required to provide documentation for several large purchases and cash withdrawals over the past 6 months. The Vegas trip? Among other things. It turns out your daughter has been quite active with luxury purchases recently. Designer handbags, jewelry, spa treatments, expensive dinners, all charged to credit cards that show her household income shouldn't support that level of spending. I thought about Sarah's Facebook posts, the casual way she'd displayed wealth that should have been impossible on her and Mark's combined salaries. She'd been living above her means for months, probably planning to use me as her personal bank whenever the bills came due. What happens when she can't provide the documentation? Patricia's voice carried professional satisfaction. The credit agencies will flag her accounts for potential fraud investigation. Her credit score will take a significant hit. Any pending loan applications will be frozen pending resolution. And if our investigation reveals a pattern of financial deception, there could be criminal implications. Criminal implications. I hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense. If Sarah had been systematically lying to banks and creditors about her income and expenses, that constituted fraud on a much larger scale than just stealing from her father. There's something else, Patricia continued. We've discovered that your daughter applied for a home equity loan last month, listing you as a co-signer without your knowledge or consent. The application was denied because the bank couldn't verify your income, but the attempt to forge your financial information is documented. My hands tightened around the phone. She'd tried to use my name on loan applications. The scope of her deception was growing beyond anything I'd imagined when I first saw those Las Vegas photos. We're forwarding that information to the district attorney's office, Patricia said. Financial identity theft is a felony in this state, especially when it involves elderly victims and family members. The word felony hit me like cold water. This was escalating beyond family drama into criminal territory. Sarah wasn't just a daughter who'd made poor choices. She was someone who'd been systematically defrauding financial institutions while using me as both a source of funds and a fictional co-signer. How serious could this get? I asked. Patricia paused before answering. Mr. Chen, if the pattern we're uncovering continues, your daughter could be looking at charges for elder financial abuse, identity theft, and wire fraud. The penalties range from heavy fines to potential jail time. This isn't just about your $22,000 anymore. I hung up feeling something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a deep sadness for the daughter I thought I'd raised. The Sarah I remembered from her childhood would never have stolen from anyone, let alone fabricated emergencies to manipulate her own father. Somewhere along the way, she'd become someone I didn't recognize. But my sadness was interrupted by another call, this one from James Mitchell, the private investigator. Mr. Chen, I've got some interesting information about your daughter's employment situation. Are you somewhere you can talk privately? I'm at home alone. What did you find? Sarah was terminated from her job 3 weeks ago for falsifying expense reports. She'd been billing personal purchases to her company credit card, then submitting fake receipts to cover the charges. Her former employer is considering criminal charges, so she'd been fired for stealing from her company at the same time she was planning to steal from me. The Vegas trip hadn't been a spontaneous splurge funded by my money. It had been a celebration of her newfound freedom to steal without workplace supervision. There's more, James continued. Her husband Mark wasn't laid off from his accounting job like you were told. He was fired 2 years ago for embezzling client funds. He's currently under investigation by the State Board of Accountancy and could lose his professional license permanently. My daughter and son-in-law weren't struggling victims of economic hardship. They were a team of thieves who'd been systematically stealing from employers, clients, and family members while maintaining the facade of respectable middle-class life. The mortgage crisis that had prompted my emergency loan was just their latest fabrication in what appeared to be a career built on financial deception. So when Sarah called me desperate about foreclosure, she and Mark were both unemployed criminals looking for their next source of easy money, I said, letting the reality sink in. That's our assessment, James confirmed. You weren't helping your daughter through a temporary crisis. You were funding active criminals who saw you as a renewable resource for their lifestyle. I thought about the years of emergency calls, the pattern of crises that always seemed to require my immediate financial intervention. Sarah's car breaking down, Mark's medical bills. credit card debt from circumstances beyond their control. How many of those emergencies had been real, and how many had been calculated manipulations designed to drain my savings while keeping me emotionally invested in their supposed struggles? My phone buzzed with another call from Sarah. This time, I answered. "Dad, thank God," she said before I could speak. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Something terrible is happening, and I think we're being targeted by some kind of scam or identity theft ring." "Hello, Sarah." "Dad, listen to me. People are calling about our credit, asking questions about our income and expenses. They're saying there are irregularities in our financial records. I think someone is using our information to commit fraud." The performance was impressive. Even knowing what I now knew about her employment termination and Mark's embezzlement investigation, Sarah managed to sound like a genuinely confused victim, rather than someone whose criminal activities were finally catching up with her. "That sounds serious," I said. "Have you contacted the police?" "Well, no, not yet. We were hoping you might know something about this. You're the only person who has access to our financial information, and this all started right after we borrowed money from you." Borrowed money. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge that she'd lied to steal from me. In her mind, fabricating a mortgage crisis to manipulate $22,000 from her elderly father still counted as borrowing. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." "Of course, Dad. What is it?" "Was there ever really a foreclosure threat? Was your mortgage actually in danger, or did you lie to me to get money for your Las Vegas vacation?" Silence stretched across the phone line. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her calculating which lie would be most effective in this moment. "Dad, I don't understand why you're asking me that." "Of course there was a foreclosure threat. Why would I lie about something so serious? Because you and Mark own your house outright. Because there is no mortgage to foreclose. Because you've been unemployed for 3 weeks after being fired for stealing from your company. Because Mark was fired 2 years ago for embezzling from his clients. Because you tried to forge my signature on a loan application without my knowledge. Because you're both criminals who saw me as an easy target." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the desperate daughter seeking help. In its place was something cold and calculating that I'd never heard from her before. "Dad, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you need to stop this right now. You're embarrassing yourself and hurting our family with these paranoid accusations." The shift was so dramatic it took my breath away. This wasn't the Sarah who'd called me crying about losing her house. This wasn't even the Sarah who'd posted vacation photos while claiming financial hardship. This was someone I'd never met before. Someone who spoke with the casual cruelty of a person who'd been caught and decided to abandon all pretense. "I'm not playing any games, Sarah. I'm simply asking for honesty about what you did with my money." "Your money?" She laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "Dad, let's be real here. You're 74 years old, living in that same crappy little house you've had since Mom died. You drive a car that's older than my kids. You clip coupons and buy generic cereal. That money was just sitting in your account doing nothing while you lived like a pauper, planning some ridiculous trip to scatter ashes in a country you'll probably never see." Each word hit me like a physical blow. This was how she really saw me. Not as a father who'd sacrificed to help her through every crisis, but as a pathetic old man too stupid to enjoy his own money. Someone whose dreams were ridiculous and whose promises to his dead wife were meaningless obstacles to her desires. "So you decided to take it," I said quietly. "I decided to put it to good use. Do you have any idea how much stress Mark and I have been under? How hard it is to maintain appearances when everyone around us is succeeding? That money gave us a weekend to breathe, to remember what it feels like to live without constantly worrying about bills and reputation and what other people think. But you weren't worried about bills, Sarah. You both had good jobs. You owned your house. You had savings. The only stress you were under was the stress of maintaining a lifestyle you were funding through theft." "Theft?" Her voice rose to a near shriek. "I'm your daughter. Everything you have should come to me eventually anyway. I just accessed my inheritance a little early to deal with a crisis you couldn't understand because you've never had to maintain professional relationships or social standing. Your inheritance." I let the words hang in the air, thinking about the $12 million she didn't know existed. The fortune that had been growing for 12 years while she saw me as nothing more than a source of emergency funding. The wealth that would have been hers someday if she'd been capable of loving me without trying to rob me. Sarah, that money wasn't your inheritance. It was my promise to your mother. It represented 12 years of saving to honor the woman who raised you and loved you unconditionally. You stole a sacred commitment to fund a vacation. Oh, please, Dad. Mom's been dead for 12 years. She doesn't care about Switzerland or ashes or any of that sentimental garbage. She's gone. That money could have helped your living family instead of being wasted on some morbid pilgrimage that won't bring her back. The casual dismissal of Margaret's memory, the reduction of our love story to sentimental garbage, broke something inside me that I hadn't even known was still intact. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about a daughter who'd grown into someone capable of spitting on her mother's grave to justify her own greed. I see, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. So in your mind, helping your living family means lying to me, stealing from me, and mocking your mother's memory. Is that the kind of help you think families should provide each other? Don't try to guilt-trip me with your martyrdom act, Dad. You've been playing the poor widower card for over a decade, sitting in that house feeling sorry for yourself instead of moving on with your life. At least I had the courage to take some of that money and actually live. The courage to steal. That's how she saw her deception. Not as a betrayal of trust or a violation of family bonds, but as courage. The kind of strength it took to manipulate an elderly parent and spend his life savings on luxury she felt entitled to enjoy. Sarah, do you remember what you said when you called me 3 days ago about the foreclosure and your children being homeless? I remember being desperate and scared, and my father being the only person I could turn to for help. You remember lying to me about a crisis that didn't exist, to steal money for a vacation you'd already planned. You remember fabricating an emergency to manipulate my emotions and access my savings account. Stop saying I stole from you. Her voice turned vicious. You gave me that money willingly. No one forced you to write that check. If you're having regrets now because you're lonely and bitter, that's not my problem. I gave you that money based on lies you told me. That's called fraud, Sarah. It's called elder financial abuse. It's called theft by deception, and in this state, it's a felony. Are you threatening me? Because if you are, Dad, you should know that I've been recording this conversation. If you try to cause trouble for my family, I'll make sure everyone knows how you've been harassing and threatening your own daughter over money you freely gave her. The revelation that she'd been recording our conversation was almost impressive in its calculation. She'd called me pretending to be confused about credit monitoring services, had manipulated me into revealing what I knew about her deception, and had documented my responses to use as evidence against me if needed. But Sarah had made one critical error in her strategic planning. She'd assumed I was still the helpless victim she'd been stealing from for years. She had no idea that while she was recording our conversation for potential legal defense, I was recording it too. And unlike her, I had a team of lawyers and investigators who knew exactly how to use such evidence. That's interesting, Sarah. You've been recording our conversation to protect yourself from consequences for stealing my money. That shows remarkable foresight for someone who claims she was just desperately responding to a crisis. I'm protecting myself from false accusations by a bitter old man who can't accept that his children have moved on with their lives. Moved on by committing fraud and identity theft. Moved on by stealing from employers and clients. Moved on by using my name on loan applications without my consent. That's quite a way to move forward with your life. The silence returned, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried something that might have been fear. How do you know about any of that? The same way I know about Mark's embezzlement investigation. The same way I know about your termination for falsifying expense reports. The same way I know about every luxury purchase you've made over the past 6 months while claiming financial hardship. I know because I hired professionals to find out exactly who my daughter has become. You hired investigators? Dad, what's wrong with you? We're family. You don't investigate family members like they're criminals. You don't steal from family members like they're strangers on the street. But apparently we both learned new things about each other this week. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, probably Sarah telling Mark about our conversation. When she returned to the phone, her voice had shifted again, this time to something that sounded almost like bargaining. Dad, look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. If you're really upset about the money, we can work something out. We can set up a payment plan or something. But you need to call off whatever investigation you started. This is getting out of hand. A payment plan. She wanted to negotiate terms for returning money she'd stolen through lies, as if we were conducting a business transaction instead of dealing with the aftermath of her betrayal. Sarah, 3 days ago you called me desperate about losing your house. Today I find out you were fired for stealing from your company. Mark was fired for embezzling from his clients, and you've been living a lifestyle funded by fraud while using me as your personal emergency fund. A payment plan doesn't address the fundamental problem here. What fundamental problem? That you're a thief who sees her own father as a target for financial manipulation. That you've built your adult life on lies and deception while pretending to be a struggling victim who needed my help. That you just told me your mother's memory is sentimental garbage, and that helping your living family means stealing from the people who love you. The phone went quiet except for the sound of Sarah breathing. In the background, I could hear what sounded like Mark's voice, urgent and angry, though I couldn't make out the words. "Dad," she said finally, her voice smaller than it had been all afternoon. "What do you want from me?" It was the first honest question she'd asked since this conversation began. Not a manipulation, not a threat, not a justification, just a simple acknowledgement that she'd created a problem that needed solving. "I want you to understand what you've done," I said. "Not just the money, but the lying, the betrayal, the complete disrespect for everything your mother and I tried to teach you about family and integrity." "Okay, I understand that you're hurt. Can we fix this? Can we?" That was the question I'd been avoiding since Harrison's team had first laid out the scope of her deception. Could someone who'd spent years systematically lying to and stealing from her own father while mocking his grief and his promises to his dead wife ever be trusted again? "Sarah, do you know what your mother told me before she died? About money and family and how wealth changes people? She told you to be careful about letting people take advantage of you. She told me not to tell you and your brother about her investments until I was sure you loved me for who I am, not what I could provide. She wanted me to know whether my children would care about their father or just see him as a source of funding for their lifestyle." "I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying that for 12 years, I've been living modestly on my teacher's pension while Margaret's investments grew larger every month. I'm saying that the father you've been lying to and stealing from isn't the broke old man you think he is." "What are you talking about?" "I'm worth over $12 million, Sarah. The woman whose memory you just called sentimental garbage left me enough money to live like a king for the rest of my life. But I chose to live simply because I wanted to know who my children really were when they thought I had nothing to offer except love." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. $12 million? $12.4 million, to be precise. More than enough to make your Vegas vacation look like pocket change. More than enough to hire the best lawyers, investigators, and forensic accountants money can buy. More than enough to make sure that people who steal from me face consequences they never imagined possible. "Dad, I didn't know. If I had known, I never would have." "You never would have what, Sarah? Never would have stolen from me, or never would have gotten caught?" But the line had gone dead. Sarah had hung up, probably to tell Mark that the helpless old man they'd been robbing for years was actually worth more money than they'd see in several lifetimes. That the father she'd just dismissed as a pathetic widower clinging to sentimental garbage had the resources to destroy them both if he chose to. I set down my phone and looked at Margaret's photo on my desk. Tomorrow, Sarah would wake up to a world where her credit was destroyed, her husband's professional license was in jeopardy, and federal investigators were examining every financial transaction they'd made over the past 5 years. She'd wanted to know what I wanted from her. The answer was simple. I wanted her to learn that actions have consequences, that families built on lies and theft eventually collapse, and that sometimes the people you think are weak turn out to be the strongest ones in the room. The war she'd started was about to become very expensive for everyone involved, but unlike Sarah, I could afford it. The next morning brought 3 developments that would reshape everything. First, Harrison called at 7:30 with news that Sarah's bank had frozen her accounts pending fraud investigation. Second, Patricia had uncovered evidence that Sarah and Mark had been running a small-scale insurance scam filing false claims for jewelry and electronics that were never actually stolen. Third, James had discovered that my grandchildren's college funds, which Sarah claimed didn't exist, actually contained over $60,000 that she'd been slowly draining for personal expenses. That last revelation hit me harder than anything else. She hadn't just stolen from me and her employers. She'd been stealing from her own children's future, liquidating their education savings to fund the luxury lifestyle she felt entitled to maintain. The grandmother college fund Margaret had established years ago, money specifically designated for my grandchildren's education, had been treated as Sarah's personal slush fund. I was staring at the documentation James had provided when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Sarah standing on my front porch, looking haggard and desperate. She'd aged years in the single day since our phone conversation, her usually perfect makeup absent, her designer clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them. I opened the door but didn't invite her inside. "Dad, please," she said without preamble. "We need to talk about this situation before it gets completely out of control." "It's already out of control, Sarah. The moment you decided to steal from your children's college fund to pay for spa treatments, it became something I couldn't ignore even if I wanted to." Her face crumpled. "You know about the college funds?" "I know about everything. The insurance fraud, the identity theft attempts, the systematic theft from your own children. I know about things you probably forgot you did because lying and stealing became so routine for you." Sarah glanced nervously at the street, probably wondering if neighbors were watching this conversation unfold on my front porch. "Can I at least come inside? People are staring." "The people who might be staring are the same neighbors who've watched you park your expensive car in my driveway for years while claiming you needed emergency money. I think they're entitled to see how this story ends." But she was already pushing past me into my living room, the same aggressive entitlement that had characterized every interaction we'd had since she became an adult. She'd never asked permission for anything, just taken what she wanted and dealt with objections later. "Dad," she said, settling into Margaret's old chair without invitation, "I need you to understand that everything got out of hand without me realizing it. The spending, the borrowing, the shortcuts we took to maintain our lifestyle. It wasn't malicious. We just got caught up in trying to provide the best life possible for our family. By stealing from that family's college funds, we were going to pay it back. All of it. The kids' money, your trip fund, everything. Mark has some business opportunities coming up that would have made it possible to replace everything we borrowed. Business opportunities." I almost laughed. Mark's business opportunities probably involved finding new clients to embezzle from or new insurance companies to defraud. Their entire adult life had been built on the assumption that there would always be someone else to steal from when the current scam ran its course. "Sarah," I said, sitting across from her in my own living room like we were strangers negotiating a business deal. "Do you remember what you said yesterday about your mother's memory being sentimental garbage?" She winced. "Dad, I was upset. I said things I didn't mean because I was scared and confused. You were caught. There's a difference. When people get caught lying and stealing, they often say things that reveal who they really are underneath all the manipulation. I'm still your daughter. I'm still the little girl you taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework. Those memories are real, even if I've made mistakes as an adult." The appeal to childhood memories was calculated, designed to trigger my paternal instincts and make me forget about her adult crimes. But I'd spent too many sleepless nights thinking about the progression from that little girl to the woman sitting in my living room asking me to excuse systematic theft and fraud as mere mistakes. "That little girl grew up to steal from her own children," I said quietly. "She grew up to lie to her elderly father about mortgage crises while spending his life savings on luxury vacations. She grew up to mock her dead mother's memory when it became inconvenient for her lifestyle choices." Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. She started crying, not the manipulative tears she'd used during phone calls asking for money, but the desperate sobbing of someone who'd finally realized the scope of the hole she'd dug for herself. "I don't know how to fix this," she said between sobs. "Everything is falling apart. Our credit is destroyed. Mark might go to prison. The kids are asking questions about why we're suddenly eating generic cereal and canceling their activities. I've ruined everything, and I don't know how to make it right." The woman sitting in my living room crying over generic cereal and canceled activities bore no resemblance to the daughter who'd raised her voice at me yesterday, calling my promises to Margaret sentimental garbage. This was the real Sarah, stripped of the pretense, finally facing consequences that couldn't be manipulated away with tears or fabricated emergencies. The millionaire father she'd dismissed as a pathetic widower had resources she'd never imagined, and now she was learning what happened when you declared war on someone who could afford to win. Margaret's wisdom echoed in my mind as I watched our daughter realize that some mistakes cost more than money. They cost family, trust, and the inheritance she'd assumed would always be waiting. She'd stolen from a man she thought was powerless, but power isn't always about what people can see. Sometimes it's about what they'll never see coming until it's too late.